The sun had climbed high by the time Clara realized that no one was coming for her. She stood on the wooden platform long after the last whistle faded into the plains, her small carpetbag at her feet, her gloved hands twisting together. Around her, the town of Millstone moved at a slow, practical pace, men unloading crates from wagons, women hurrying with baskets, children chasing a stray dog down the dusty street. No one seemed to notice the lone young woman waiting with eyes full of hope slowly dimming into worry. Finally, a man in a brown vest and spectacles approached her. He was older, with the weary patience of someone used to explaining things twice. "Miss, you seem a bit lost." "Waiting on someone?" he asked kindly. "Yes," Clara replied, forcing a smile. "My fiancé, Mr. Samuel Carter. He was to meet me here today." She unfolded the creased letter, smoothing its edges as though it might lend her words more weight. "He said he runs a ranch near Millstone." The man frowned. "Samuel Carter, you say?" He scratched his chin. "Can't say I've heard the name. I've lived here 15 years, but maybe the postmaster would know. He keeps track of all the homesteads around. Grateful for any help." Clara followed him to the small post office at the corner of Main Street. The building smelled of dust and paper, and behind the counter stood a stout man with a tidy mustache and ink stains on his sleeves. When she handed him the letter, he adjusted his spectacles and read the address twice. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we don't have any Samuel Carter listed in our delivery records. Not in Millstone, nor the neighboring settlements." Clara's stomach dropped. "Are you certain?" "Quite." He tapped the letter. "This return address doesn't even exist. It's from a P.O. box that was rented for 1 month, then closed. No forwarding address, no ranch, no nothing." "I'm sorry, miss." The word struck her like a blow. She felt the blood rush from her face, the edges of her vision blurring. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "He wrote me for months. He sent money for my fare." But the postmaster only shook his head, pity softening his voice. "You've been tricked, I'm afraid. These things happen, especially to good folks looking for a new start." Clara stumbled outside, the dry wind catching her bonnet and the weight of the truth sinking heavy in her chest. The letter, the promises, the dreams she debuilt from ink and hope, all of it was a lie. She found herself sitting on the edge of the boardwalk, staring down at the dirt road as if the answer might be written there. A few townsfolk passed, glancing at her with curiosity. She could feel their whispers brushing against her like nettles. A mail-order bride who came to no one. A woman without a home, without a name that anyone knew. She stayed like that for hours until the shadows grew long and the air cooled. Hunger and shame warred in her chest. She thought of finding the next train east, but she had little money left, only a few coins and the clothes she wore. Going back meant facing the women at the boarding house who had warned her not to trust strangers. Going back meant admitting she had been fooled. When the first stars appeared, she rose and wandered the silent street. Lamps flickered in windows, laughter spilled from the saloon, and somewhere nearby the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal echoed through the dusk. It was the sound of work, of life continuing even as hers felt paused in heartbreak. Drawn to it, Clara followed the glow of the forge, a faint orange light cutting through the dark. She didn't know it yet, but within that fire waited the man whose hands would one day rebuild not only iron, but her heart. The sound of the hammer guided her through the twilight like a heartbeat, steady, sure, and alive. Clara followed the rhythmic clang down a narrow lane behind the general store until the flicker of orange light came into view. The blacksmith's forge stood there, half open to the night, its heat spilling into the cool air. Sparks leapt and fell like fireflies as a man worked at the anvil, his broad shoulders moving with the weight of each strike. He didn't notice her at first. She stood a few paces away, watching him lift the glowing metal with his tongs, the muscles of his arms flexing with effort. Each movement spoke of strength and patience, like he was shaping the world one stroke at a time. The light caught his face, square-jawed, sun-darkened, and dusted with soot, yet there was gentleness in his expression even as he worked with fire. Clara hesitated, clutching her carpetbag to her chest. She had no reason to be here, no words ready. But the forge's warmth called to her, a comfort against the cold ache of loneliness. At last he set down his hammer and turned. His eyes, gray as river stone, softened when they met hers. "Evenin', miss," he said in a voice deep and calm. "You look a bit lost." "I suppose I am," Clara admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I arrived on the afternoon train. I was meant to meet someone. But it seems he isn't here." The blacksmith wiped his hands on a rag, frowning with concern. "You've been standing out there all this time?" He gestured toward a wooden stool near the forge. "Please, sit a spell. The night's turning cold." She hesitated only a moment before sitting. The stool was rough but sturdy, and the heat from the fire soaked into her bones. For the first time that day, she felt something other than despair. "My name's Elias Moore," the man said, offering a small smile. "Been the blacksmith here in Millstone near 10 years, and you, miss?" "Clara Bennett." She managed a faint smile in return. "I came from Boston. I was to marry a rancher named Samuel Carter." Elias's brow furrowed. "Don't reckon I've heard that name before." Her throat tightened. "No one has, it seems." She couldn't finish. The words were too humiliating, too final. Elias said nothing for a while. The only sound was the crackle of the forge. Then, quietly, he said, "That's a cruel thing, what was done to you." The gentleness in his voice undid her. Tears she'd been holding back all day welled up and spilled over. I thought he was real," she whispered. "I gave up everything for a lie." Elias took a slow breath, his hands tightening around the rag. "You're not the fool here," he said firmly. "The man who lied to you is. Don't let his deceit make you doubt your worth." She looked up, startled by the kindness in his tone. No pity, only quiet respect. The words warmed something in her that the forge could not. He reached for a kettle on the side table and poured her a tin cup of coffee, black and strong. "Drink," he said simply. "You need a bit of strength after the day you've had." Clara accepted it with trembling hands. The first sip burned her tongue, but she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was still alive. When she finally rose to leave, Elias nodded toward the small cabin behind the forge. "I've a spare room," he said, cautious but sincere. "Ain't much, just a bed and 4 walls. But it's safe, and I don't fancy seeing you sleep on the street." Her instinct was to refuse, propriety, fear, pride, but exhaustion won. "Just for the night," she whispered. Elias nodded once. "Just for the night." And as she stepped into the warmth of his cabin, the door closing softly behind her, Clara didn't know that her life had just turned a corner, that in this stranger-as forge, the embers of her broken heart were about to be rekindled. Morning came slowly to Millstone, with a pale gold light slipping through the curtains of Elias Moore's cabin. Clara stirred on the narrow cot he had set up for her, still half wrapped in the wool blanket he'd insisted she take. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and iron, but beneath it lingered something warmer, the scent of coffee brewing. She rose quietly, smoothing the borrowed quilt before stepping into the main room. Elias stood by the stove, already dressed for the day, his sleeves rolled up and his hair damp from washing. He looked over when she entered and gave a polite nod. "Mornin', Miss Bennett. Hope you slept a bit." Clara nodded, though the truth was she hadn't slept much at all. Every creak of the cabin had kept her half awake, uncertain of her place, of her future. Yet when she saw Elias pouring coffee into 2 tin cups, she felt an unfamiliar comfort. "I've been thinking," he said, setting 1 cup in front of her. "If you've nowhere to go, you could stay here a while, just till you find your footing. Cabin's big enough for 2, and I've lived alone long enough not to mind company." Clara hesitated. "That's very kind, Mr. Moore, but I couldn't possibly impose." He gave a soft shrug. "Not an imposition if it's my offer. And folks in this town may talk, but talk don't hurt near as much as hunger or cold." His words struck her as both gentle and practical, a mix she had rarely known in a man. She thanked him quietly, promising she would repay his kindness however she could. By afternoon, she'd rolled up her sleeves and was sweeping the cabin, scrubbing dishes, and kneading dough for supper. It wasn't a charity if she worked for it. That was how she made peace with accepting help. As the days passed, the arrangement between them fell into a quiet rhythm. Elias worked at the forge from dawn until dusk, shaping horseshoes, nails, and wagon rims. Clara kept the cabin clean, cooked his meals, and mended his clothes. In the evenings, they'd share supper in companionable silence. Sometimes he'd tell her stories of the early days in Millstone, of blizzards and floods, of stubborn mules and kind neighbors. His laughter, when it came, was deep and rare, like thunder in summer. But not everyone saw their companionship kindly. Whispers began in the town before the week was out. When Clara went to buy flour, 2 women near the counter lowered their voices, glancing her way. "Living with the blacksmith, is she? Without a ring?" One murmured, "Mail order bride come to no one, and now she's playing house," said the other. Clara's cheeks burned, but she said nothing. Pride kept her chin high as she paid and walked out. Yet the words clung to her all the way back to the forge. That evening, as she stirred stew on the stove, Elias noticed her quietness. "Someone say something to you in town?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. They think I've forgotten what's proper." Elias's jaw tightened. He set down his hammer with a sharp clang. "Let 'em talk. They don't know you." "You've done nothing wrong." Clara looked up at him, startled by the fire in his voice. He met her gaze, eyes fierce and kind all at once. "You're a good woman who got dealt a hard hand. You're working, helping, and holding your head high. That's more decent than most." The words settled deep in her heart. For the first time since arriving in Millstone, Clara didn't feel like a foolish girl or a charity case. She felt seen. Later, as the forge glowed softly outside and Elias worked under the starlight, she watched him through the window. His movements were steady, deliberate, a man who built things to last. And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps fate hadn't brought her to ruin, but to the very place she was meant to be. The summer wind swept through Millstone, carrying the dry scent of dust and heat. It was the kind of season that made tempers short and days long, when the air shimmered above the dirt road and the grass crackled underfoot. At the forge, Elias worked tirelessly despite the heat, his hammer rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the entire town. Clara had grown used to the music of his labor, the hiss of iron in water, the rasp of metal against stone. She often brought him cool water or wiped his brow when the sweat stung his eyes. In return, he would offer her a small, grateful smile. And though few words passed between them, something unspoken had begun to bloom, a trust forged quietly through kindness and shared space. But life in Millstone had its cruel twists, and one evening that trust would be tested by fire itself. It started with a shout from down the street, a frantic call that shattered the stillness of twilight. Fire, the livery's on fire. Clara dropped the bowl she was washing and rushed to the door. A thick column of smoke was rising from the direction of the stable, orange flames licking the sky. Horses screamed in terror as men ran to form a bucket line from the well. Without hesitation, Elias grabbed his gloves and ran toward the blaze. "Stay here, Clara," he called, but she was already following him, skirts gathered in her fists. The fire had spread fast, eating through dry timber and hay. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe. Elias pushed through the crowd to help pull the frightened horses free. Each time he emerged from the smoke, Clara felt her heart stutter, fear clawing at her throat. Then someone shouted, "The forge!" The fire is spreading to the forge. Clara turned and saw the truth of it. A stray spark carried by the wind had caught on the roof of Elias's workshop. Flames curled upward, devouring the wood with greedy hunger. "Elias!" she screamed, but he was still at the livery. Without thinking, she ran toward the forge, her skirt hem catching on the ground as she threw open the door. Inside, the heat was unbearable. Sparks flew like angry bees, and smoke burned her eyes. She grabbed a blanket from the cot and beat at the flames along the wall, coughing as the fire roared louder. Through the haze, she heard Elias's voice. "Clara, get out!" He burst through the door, face streaked with soot, and dragged her backward just as a beam collapsed where she had been standing. They stumbled into the open air, both coughing violently. Elias pushed her behind him, then went back in, desperate to save his tools, his anvil, anything. "Elias, no!" she cried, but he was already gone inside. For endless seconds, all she could see was fire and smoke. Then, as if the forge itself exhaled, he emerged again, staggering and clutching a blackened box, the one that held his father's old tools. He fell to his knees, gasping. Clara ran to him, throwing her arms around his shoulders. The forge burned to the ground that night. By dawn, only the anvil remained, scarred but solid amid the ashes. Clara sat beside Elias, wrapping his burned hands in bandages. The smell of smoke clung to them both, but she felt no fear anymore. "You could have died," she whispered, her eyes wet. He gave a faint smile. "So could you. Seems we're both stubborn fools." Clara managed a soft laugh through her tears. "Then I suppose we'll have to keep each other out of trouble." Elias looked at her then, really looked, and in his weary gaze she saw something more than gratitude. It was as if the fire had burned away every pretense, leaving only truth between them. In the ruins of the forge, something new had been forged, not of metal, but of hearts tempered by courage and care. And though they didn't yet speak of it, both knew their lives had been forever changed by the night the flames took everything except each other. By morning, the fire was nothing but smoke and silence. The forge lay in ruins, twisted metal, cracked stone, and piles of ash that still smoldered faintly in the dawn light. Clara stood beside Elias, both of them covered in soot and exhaustion. The air was heavy with loss, yet beneath it lingered a fragile peace. They were alive. That, for now, was enough. As the sun climbed higher, the townsfolk began to gather. Millstone was small. News traveled faster than wildfire. At first, the crowd came out of curiosity, but when they saw Elias's blackened hands and Clara's blistered palms, the tone shifted. Whispers rose. She ran into the flames for him. He nearly died saving his forge. The same people who once gossiped about impropriety now stared with quiet awe. For the first time, their eyes held something other than judgment. Elias, stubborn as always, tried to push himself up and inspect the wreckage, but Clara placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You'll do no such thing," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "You're in no condition to work," he chuckled weakly. "You sound like my mother." Then she must have had good sense. She guided him back toward the cabin. His palms were raw and red beneath the bandages she'd wrapped the night before, and his steps were slow, but he didn't argue. It was the first time she'd seen him let someone care for him without resistance. Over the next few days, Clara nursed him with quiet devotion. She changed his dressings, cooled his fever, and made broth from what little they had left. When he tried to thank her, she simply said, "You saved me first." The forge could be rebuilt, but lives could not. She was determined to see his strength return before any talk of work began again. As word of their bravery spread, the tone in town began to change. The widow schoolmistress, Mrs. Farrow, was the first to knock on their door, bringing a jar of honey and a basket of biscuits. "You're both heroes," she said with a warm smile. "The town owes you thanks." Then came Pastor Hensley's wife with clean bandages and a promise to gather donations for rebuilding. Even the shopkeeper who once whispered about Clara offered her flour and sugar, insisting it was just a kindness. At first, Clara didn't know how to accept their goodwill. She had spent weeks carrying the weight of their scorn. To suddenly feel their sympathy was almost too much. But Elias, ever practical, simply said, "Sometimes it takes a fire to melt cold hearts." That night, as she watched him rest, she thought about those words. Perhaps the fire hadn't only destroyed. Perhaps it had purified. The flames had burned away not only wood and iron, but the lies and shame that had clung to her since the day she arrived. Days turned into weeks, and the forge's ruins became a place of purpose. Men from the town came with shovels and lumber, offering to help Elias rebuild. Clara worked beside them, her hands blistered but steady, her dress smudged with ash and sawdust. No one whispered any more. When they looked at her, they saw courage, not scandal. And for Elias, there was quiet pride in watching her work alongside him. "You've got more grit than half the men here," he said one afternoon, his voice full of admiration. She smiled, brushing dirt from her cheek. "That's because I had to." When the new frame of the forge finally stood, strong and bright against the evening sky, the townsfolk cheered. The moment felt like a rebirth, for the forge, for Elias, and for Clara. That night, when the last hammer was laid down and the others had gone home, Elias and Clara stood together in the doorway, looking at the structure they had rebuilt from ashes. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. Elias nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "It's ours." The words lingered in the air between them, simple, unplanned, and true. And though neither spoke it aloud, they both felt it. Millstone was no longer just a place where she'd been abandoned. It was where she had been remade. Autumn arrived quietly in Millstone, tinting the hills with shades of rust and gold. The rebuilt forge now stood proudly by the lane, its roof gleaming with new tin, its chimney breathing soft curls of smoke. Elias was back at work. Though he moved a little slower than before, his palms still healing beneath thin gloves. Clara had taken to helping him, fetching tools, keeping the fire steady, and polishing finished pieces with a care that made Elias smile. Their days were full but peaceful, marked by the rhythm of hammers and the hum of shared silence. Life had steadied into something warm and familiar. Yet, beneath the comfort, a shadow still lingered, the ghost of the lie that had brought her here. Then one morning, as Clara swept the forge floor, a knock came at the door. It was the postmaster, a round man with kind eyes who now greeted her respectfully, a far cry from the wary politeness of months before. "Miss Bennet," he said, tipping his hat, "a letter came for you, postmarked from back east." Clara blinked in surprise. "For me?" She hadn't received mail since the day her dreams had crumbled at the train station. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a woman's hand, delicate but hurried. She thanked the postmaster and sat on the porch steps to open it. Elias, curious, looked up from his work, but said nothing, giving her space. The letter began plainly. "Dear Miss Bennet, you don't know me, but I believe we were both deceived by the same man." Clara's heart stilled as she read on. The woman, signing herself as Evelyn Porter of St. Louis, wrote that she too had corresponded with a man calling himself Samuel Carter. He had written in the same affectionate tone, promising marriage and a home in the West. Evelyn had sent him her savings, money meant to start her life anew, only to discover months later that he had vanished, his letters returned, his address false. "I found your name," Evelyn continued, "through the Postal Service records. There were several of us, it seems. You are not alone in your heartbreak. I thought you should know the truth, that he was never real, and that none of us were foolish to believe. We were simply hopeful in a world that too often punishes hope." By the time Clara reached the end, tears blurred the page. The ache she thought had dulled returned, but it was different now, less bitter, more freeing. For so long she had blamed herself for being naive, for wanting too much. But reading Evelyn's words, she understood. She hadn't been foolish. She had been human, a woman longing for a place to belong, daring to believe in something kind. Elias noticed her quiet trembling and came to sit beside her. "Bad news?" he asked softly. She shook her head, wiping her cheeks. "Not bad, just truth." She handed him the letter, and he read it in silence. When he finished, he folded it carefully and said, "Then you've got your answer." Clara nodded. "Yes, he wasn't real." Her voice wavered, then steadied. "But what I've found here is—" Elias looked at her for a long moment, the forge's glow reflected in his eyes. "You've got strength, Clara, more than most. Don't let some ghost from back east take that from you." She smiled faintly. "He already did once. I won't let him do it again." That night, as she sat by the window, the letter from Evelyn beside her, Clara felt something inside her settle. The shame she had carried since her arrival was gone. In its place was peace, quiet, steady, and real. Outside, the forge flickered, and Elias's voice drifted from the workshop. The sound was as comforting as a heartbeat. Clara looked toward the glow, her chest tightening with something that wasn't sorrow at all. It was gratitude. The man she had come to find had never existed, but the one she had found instead was made of flesh, fire, and heart. And in that truth, she found her freedom. The first frost came early that year, frosting the edges of the fields and painting the forge roof silver by dawn. Clara woke before the sun, as she often did, and stood by the window wrapped in a shawl. The sky was pale and quiet, the kind of cold that made breath hang like smoke. Inside, the small house was warm with the smell of coffee and iron. Elias was already at work, though the forge's roar was softer now, more patient. He had healed, but the fire that had nearly taken him had left its mark, a stiffness in his shoulder, a gentleness in his hands. Clara loved that gentleness, though she had never said so. The letter from Evelyn Porter still sat in her drawer, folded neatly among her things. She had reread it several times since it arrived, but the sadness it once brought had faded. It had become a reminder, not of deceit, but of how far she'd come. That morning, when she brought Elias his breakfast, a plate of biscuits and ham, she found him standing outside the forge, staring at the rising smoke. He seemed lost in thought. "Elias?" she asked softly. He looked over his shoulder and smiled faintly. "Just thinking," he said. "This place almost burned to nothing, and now look at it." "It's because you didn't give up," she said, setting the plate beside him. He glanced at her then, his gaze holding hers longer than usual. "Wasn't just me," he said quietly. "I'd have been ash without you." Her breath caught, but she tried to hide it. "You'd have done the same for anyone." He shook his head. "No, Clara, not anyone." The words hung between them, soft and dangerous. She felt her cheeks warm and turned away, pretending to straighten a horseshoe on the anvil. But Elias stepped closer, his voice roughened by something unspoken. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart thudded. "What is it?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "When you came off that train, I thought you'd brought trouble. The whole town did. I told myself I didn't want you here. But every day since, you've been the one thing I look forward to seeing." Clara froze, her pulse fluttering in her throat. Elias continued, his words halting but sincere. "You came here looking for a man who wasn't real. But somehow, you found your way to me. And now, I can't imagine this place without you in it." For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the forge fire. Clara's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. She'd spent months holding herself together, refusing to believe she deserved more than kindness. Yet here it was, offered plainly and without pity. "Elias," she whispered, but he raised a hand gently, as if afraid to startle her. "I ain't a man of fancy words," he said, "but I know what's true. You saved my life, Clara, not just from the fire, but from being alone. I don't expect anything from you. I just needed you to know." Her voice trembled. "You think I don't feel the same?" Elias blinked, caught off guard. "You do?" She nodded, stepping closer. "You were the first person who saw me for who I am, not what the town thought, not what some letter promised. You gave me a home when I had nowhere left to go. How could I not care for you?" The words came out barely above a whisper, but they were enough. Elias reached out, his calloused fingers brushing her cheek. For the first time, she didn't pull away. The world outside seemed to fade. The cold, the forge, the past, leaving only the quiet hum of something new and real between them. He didn't kiss her then, though the air seemed to beg for it. Instead, he said, "Then stay, not just until spring. Stay for good." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she smiled through them. "I was already planning to," and as the forge fire crackled behind them, the warmth between them burned brighter than any flame Elias had ever kindled. Snow-blanketed Millstone that December, soft and unbroken, muffling every sound except the faint ring of Elias's hammer from the forge. The world seemed to hold its breath under a silver sky. Smoke curled from the chimney of his small cabin, and light flickered through the windows like a beacon against the cold. Inside, the smell of pine and bread filled the air. Clara's doing, of course. She moved through the kitchen with calm certainty, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair falling loose from its braid. It had been a month since that morning at the forge when Elias confessed his feelings, and everything between them had quietly changed. The easy rhythm of their days continued. She still helped at the forge, still tended the home, but beneath it pulsed something deeper, something spoken in glances, in quiet laughter, in the way their hands brushed without hesitation. The townsfolk, once so full of whispers, now greeted her with open smiles. Mrs. Farrow had taken to calling her Miss Clara Blackwell, though no such name had been written yet. The pastor's wife had begun collecting scraps of lace just in case, and the shopkeeper's daughters often stopped by to admire the ring Elias had forged himself, a simple band of iron, hammered smooth and polished to a soft shine. Elias had given it to Clara one evening in early winter. He hadn't made a speech. He'd simply set it in her palm and said, "I didn't have gold, but I had this and my word." She had slipped it on without hesitation, her eyes shining with tears. "It's worth more than gold," she had whispered, and she had meant it. Now, the wedding was set for Christmas Eve, a small ceremony at the chapel near the edge of town. No lavish gown, no crowd of guests from back east, just a handful of friends, the pastor, and the man who had turned her broken journey into a home. That morning, as she fastened her shawl, Clara looked at her reflection in the mirror. The dress she wore was borrowed, cream-colored wool with a ribbon of faded blue. Her hands trembled slightly, but her heart was steady. She thought of the letter she had first received promising love and belonging, a lie that had sent her west. How strange that the same journey of deceit had led her to something real. When she stepped outside, the cold air kissed her cheeks pink. Elias stood waiting by the sleigh, dressed in a freshly pressed shirt and dark coat, his hair brushed back but still stubborn at the edges. He looked nervous, a sight that made her smile. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, half teasing. She met his gaze, her breath misting in the air. "I've never been sure of anything." They rode to the chapel together through fields of untouched snow. The sound of the sleigh bells mingled with the hush of winter wind. When they arrived, the townsfolk were already waiting, a modest gathering, but full of warmth. The pastor smiled as they entered. The ceremony was simple. Elias's hand trembled slightly when he took hers, his rough thumb brushing over her knuckles. When the pastor spoke the final blessing, Clara felt something within her settle, as if the earth itself had sighed in relief. "You may kiss the bride," the pastor said gently. Elias hesitated for half a heartbeat, then leaned in and kissed her, slow, certain, and full of everything they had endured. The crowd cheered softly, and even Mrs. Farrow dabbed at her eyes. Later, at the forge, where a small supper waited, Elias lifted his glass. "To ashes and beginnings," he said. Clara smiled, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "To finding what was real." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, steady, endless, as the forge's fire glowed through the window. It was the same fire that had once destroyed and rebuilt their world. Now it burned quietly, faithfully, like the life they had forged together, born from ruin, tempered by love, and lasting as iron.